Welcome everyone to our Fort Bragg Seventh-day Adventist Sabbath School class. Today, Dean is not with us. He has COVID. So please remember him in your prayers, and Mona as well, his whole family, that she won't get it and that he will heal quickly. Our lesson is on Joseph, the master of dreams. And we're going to start out with prayer. Can you bow your heads, please? Heavenly Father, we want to ask you to guide this whole study, to help us to all interact in a way that brings glory to you. We ask you also to be with me throughout this period of time, that I will only say what you want me to say. We ask this in your name. Amen. Well, we start out in Genesis. This whole lesson study has been on Genesis, and it's been really good. This is the story of Joseph, and the last 37 to 50 covers the life of Joseph from the time that he is in Canaan. He has his first dreams to his death when he's in Egypt in chapter 50. In fact, Joseph occupies more space in the book of Genesis than does any other patriarch. Although Joseph is just one of Jacob's sons, he is presented in Genesis as a great patriarch like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As we will see too, the life of Joseph highlights two important theological truths. First, God fulfills his promises. Second, God can turn evil into good. In this week's study, we will focus on the early life of Joseph. He is Jacob's favorite son. Now I want to ask, why do you think Jacob was his favorite son? What brought him to be the favorite son?
He was the son of his old age. The Bible says that he was the son of his old age. And
okay.
Plus, he was the son of his favorite wife,
Rebecca,
which was Rachel.
Rachel.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and because he had more than one wife, I think the whole family was influenced not just by the father, but of course by the mothers. Yeah. And so I think that plays a big part in this whole story, is the fact that they had different mothers. So let's look into that some more. So he was called the master of dreams, and because he was an expert in dreams. But was he the expert in dreams? No, he wasn't. He allowed God to use him to interpret the dreams, but he wasn't the expert of dreams. God gave him dreams. It wasn't something that he just had. He was very close to God. And that's another thing that this whole lesson said to me, was that he was raised by a different mother, and then he lost his mother. And so I think because of that, he became closer to his father than the other sons did. The other sons were influenced by their mother. They were influenced by each other. They were influenced by their jealousy, and maybe part of that came from their mothers. So he ended up being hated. And, you know, when you see kids being treated different in families, you can see resentment in some children because they feel like another child is more favored, treated better. So that's what happens here. In these chapters, we will see that God's providence is affirmed despite all the evil and wickedness in the evil hearts. We're going to go to Sunday's lesson, which is on family troubles. Jacob has at last settled in the land, while Isaac was only a stranger. So we're going to read Genesis 37, 1 through 11. Jonathan's going to read that for us.
Now Jacob dwelt in the land of Canaan. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also he made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all the brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, "Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheaves stood all around, and bowed down to my sheaf." And his brothers said to him, "Shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more, for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed still another dream, and told it to his brothers, and said, "Look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me." So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you?" And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind.
So now we have another thing for the brothers to hate him for. And on top of that, Joseph seemed to be a tattletale, but it wasn't being just a tattletale. He was worried about his brothers. He was worried about the things that they were doing, the things they were saying. The brothers came together in their hatred against Joseph, and I think all of this plays into the fact that he was loved so much by his father. But part of the reason why I think he was loved so much by his father is because he had lost his favorite wife. And when you lose somebody that you love so much, I think you hold on to that child even more. And so I think that played into it too. I don't think it was intentional that he would love this son more than the rest. I think it's just circumstances created this. And when the lesson says that the brothers hid their hatred from their father. Of course, the father knew that there was problems there, but he didn't know the depth of that hatred. And so I don't think he would have sent his son out to find the brothers had he known that. So it says the father enjoyed a very special relationship with his son, and I just said part of the reasons why. And because he was having dreams, and the father kind of downplayed those dreams, but he kept it in the back of his mind because he just wondered if, some of this was going to come true. Now, I can't see Joseph because the lesson says that he was a very tender-hearted, loving child. That because of the time that he spent with his father, he loved God very much because if you remember right, Jacob had done the ladder, and after he did the ladder fighting with God, he became real close to God. And so he wanted to portray that into his son. And the only one that really clung to his father because he didn't have a mother was this son. And so why wouldn't that make him more special too? So we're going to go and do Matthew 20, 26 and 27.
But it shall not be so among you, but whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant.
So the question here is, what crucial principle is revealed here, and how can we learn to manifest in our own lives what it teaches? However horrible the events that were to follow, they're not hard to comprehend. To be in that close proximity to, and even to be related to someone whom you hated, would inevitably lead to, sooner or later, only to trouble. And it did. Do you want to read Genesis 37, 12 through 36, Jonathan?
Then his brothers went to feed their flocks, or their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." So he said to him, "Here I am." Then he said to him, "Please go and see if it is well with your brothers, and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me." So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Now a certain man found him, and there he was, wandering in the field. And the men asked him, saying, "What are you seeking?" So he said, "I am seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they are feeding their flocks." And the man said, "They have departed from here, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. Now when he saw them afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. And they said to one another, "Look, this dreamer is coming. Come therefore, let us now kill him, and cast him into some pit, and we shall say some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams." But Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands, and said, "Let us not kill him." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit, which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands, and bring him back to his father." So it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. Then they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it, and they sat down to eat a meal. Then after they lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers listened. Then the Midianite traders passed by. So the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Then Reuben returned to the pit, and indeed Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes. And he returned to his brothers and said, "The lad is no more, and I, where shall I go?" So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not?" And he recognized it and said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, the officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard.
So it looks like there are two brothers that wanted to try to preserve him. One that said, "Let's just put him in a pit and leave him there." He was trying to prolong him getting killed. And then the other brother that said, "Well, let's just sell him. That would prolong his life, but, for a long time, and he would be out of the way, so he wouldn't be in danger." So it looks like there were at least two brothers that really didn't want him to die. One of my questions when I was studying this was this God's plan that he gets sold? Did God plan this, or did just God use what happened to do what needed to be done for Joseph to be in Egypt to save all the people. Any thoughts on that? Okay. So, after they cast him in the pit, they were planning on killing him, but they didn't. So now he is sold into Egypt. Now we go to a different story. Because Judah, one of the sons that didn't want him to die, leaves there. And he goes out away from his brothers. He can't stand it. And this, it says it's very chronologically, this is where the story belongs, because it happened right after Joseph was sold into slavery. And so if someone would read chapter 38 of Genesis. 38, yeah.
About this time, Judah left home and moved to Adullam, where he stayed with a man named Hera. There he saw a Canaanite woman, the daughter of Shua, and he married her. When he slept with her, she became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and he named him Then she became pregnant again and gave birth to another son, and named him Onan. And when she gave birth to when she gave birth to a third son, she named him Shelah. At that time, Shelah's birth, they were living in Kezib. In the course of time, Judah arranged for his firstborn son, to marry a young woman named Tamar. But was a wicked man in the Lord's sight, so the Lord took his life. Then Judah said to Er's brother Onan, "Go and marry Tamar, as our law requires of the brother of the man who has died. You must produce an heir for your brother." But Onan was not willing to have a child who would not be his own heir. Excuse me. So whenever he had intercourse with his brother's wife, he spilt the semen on the ground. This prevented her from having a child who would belong to his brother. But the Lord considered it evil for Onan to deny a child to his dead brother. So the Lord took Onan's life too. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Go back to your parents' home and remain a widow until my son Shelah is old enough to marry you." But Judah didn't really intend to do this because he was afraid Shelah would also die, like his two brothers. So Tamar went back to live in her father's home. Some years later, Judah's wife died. After the time of mourning was over, Judah and his friend Hera, the Adullamite, went up to Tamar to supervise the shearing of his sheep. Someone told Tamar, "Look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." Tamar was aware that Shelah had grown up, but no arrangements had been made for her to come and marry him. So she changed out of her widow's clothing and covered herself with a veil to disguise herself. Then she sat beside the road at the entrance to the village in Imnam, which is on the road to Tamar. Judah noticed her and thought she was a prostitute, since she had covered her face. So he stopped and propositioned her. "Let me have sex with you," he said, not realizing that she was his own daughter-in-law. How much will you pay to have sex with me?" Tamar asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, Judah promised. But what that, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I got it. But what will you give me to guarantee what you send? Will you send the goat? She asked. What kind of guarantee do you want? He replied. She answered, leave me your identification seal and its cord and the walking stick you are carrying. So Judah gave them to her. Then he had intercourse with her, and she became pregnant. Afterward, she went back home, took off her veil, and put on her widow's clothing as usual. Later, Judah asked his friend Hera, the Aldamite, to take the young goat to the woman and pick up the things he had given her as his guarantee. But Hera couldn't find her. So he asked the men who lived there, where can I find the shrine prostitute who was sitting beside the road at the entrance to Emma? We've never had a shrine prostitute here, they replied. So Hera returned to Judah and told him, I couldn't find her anywhere, and the men of the village claimed they've never had a shrine prostitute there. Then let her keep the things I gave her, Judah said. I sent the young goat as we agreed, but you couldn't find her. We'd be the laughing stock of the village if we went back again to look for her. About 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has acted like a prostitute, and now because of this, she's pregnant. Bring her out and let her be burnt, Judah demanded. But as they were taking her out to kill her, she sent this message to her father-in-law. The man who owns these things made me pregnant. Look closely. Whose seal and cord and walking stick are these? Judah recognized them immediately and said, she is more righteous than I am, because I didn't arrange for her to marry my son Shelah, and Judah never slept with Tamar again. When the time came for Tamar to give birth, it was discovered that she was carrying twins. While she was in labor, one of the babies reached out his hand. The midwife grabbed it and tied a scarlet string around the child's wrist, announcing, this one came out first. But then he pulled back his hand, and out came his brother. Wait, the midwife exclaimed. How did you break out first? So he was named Perez. Then the baby with the scarlet string on his wrist was born, and he was named Zerah.
Conclusion of this sword story is the birth of Perez, meaning breaking through, who, like Jacob, is born second and becomes first, and is named in salvation history as the ancestor of David by Ruth, of David, and ultimately of Jesus Christ. As for Tamar, she is the first of 4 women, followed by Rahab, Ruth, and the wife of Uriah, who preceded Mary, the mother of Jesus. I think it's amazing in the timeline of Jesus are all these different stories of people that were evil, and they turned their lives around by giving their life to God. And it's just, to me, that's hope for us. That's real hope for us, because all these things happen, and yet they are in the timeline, and we are too. We're not in the timeline of before Christ, but we're in the timeline of after Christ. And so it gives us hope, wonderful hope. So that is the story of Judah. And so now we have Joseph, and he's a slave in Egypt. Wednesday's lesson. We pick up that story there. And Joseph is now working as a slave. Now, he was a privileged child. And I can imagine on that trip from the pit to Egypt what was in his head. But he trusted in God. And he didn't know what was going to happen through a lot of part of the rest of his life. But he trusted in God. And God took care of him. There were times, though, I'm sure he probably felt like, did God abandon me? I mean, that would be natural for any of us to think. And if you're thrown in prison and you don't seem to have God with you, God was with him. So almost immediately, Joseph was characterized as a man of success. He was so good, and his master so trusted him that he gave him everything. He gave him to be over his whole household. And then that led to the story of what happened to him there. So we go to, this is Genesis 40. So can you go to Genesis 40, 3 and 4?
So you want me to read verse 3 and 4? Okay.
Yes, please.
So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them. So they were in custody for a while.
So why do you think, and I'd like it if I could get answers on this, why do you think Joseph got to this point where he was trusted? What are some of the characters that you think Joseph had? And there's a mic here, we can pass it around. Just think about some of the characters that Joseph had and tell me what you think they might have been. Do you guys have any ideas there? What kind of traits he had, yes.
Yeah.
He was, can you take him to mine?
Yeah.
He was trustworthy. What other type of things do you think made somebody trust him with everything?
Honesty.
Honesty. Yes. He was trustworthy. He was honest. I think he was kind. He was gentle. I don't think that, I think when somebody saw him, they had love for him. They felt like they were safe leaving everything with him. So,
Well, and the Lord was with him.
say that again.
The Lord was with him
Yes, the Lord was with him.
and gave the people that he spoke to and dealt with a open heart for him, for Joseph, and recognized there was something different about Joseph. He didn't act like a guilty man. He didn't behave like he was trying to make up for something that he did wrong, because he didn't do anything wrong.
The lesson also brings out that he was a friend. He was a confidant. He was somebody that they could speak to and tell everything and not have fear that they were going to get stabbed in the back. Because in those days, if you were somebody that had a position, there were always somebody else that wanted to take you out. But Joseph didn't. He didn't. He had their back. He did everything he could to make life better, not just for himself, but for everyone around him, the people that were in the prison, for everyone. But he has an experience that happens to him. What is that? What happens to him that makes him kind of run?
the situation with Potiphar's wife?
Yes, with Potiphar's wife. So
Yeah.
that's our next part.
And that's interesting too, really, when you think about it, because Potiphar knew that he was innocent. If he would have been guilty, he would have fled off the property, but he was still there when he came back. But I think, reading the story, that to save respect out of respect for his wife, he made it the story like, okay, I'm going to punish him for this, but he didn't take his life because he knew he was innocent, and that was a hard thing. I think when you think about the whole deal of being, I don't know if you've ever had that happen in your life, but I know I have. One time when I was probably about 12 or 13, I had a BB gun, and I had some friends that got BB guns, and one of the neighbors that shot it was shooting around the yard and hit a neighbor just below the eye. Could have took his eye out. And anyway, one of the neighbors had shot him in the eye, and so another neighbor said that he saw me shoot him, and I wasn't even out in the front yard shooting the BB gun. And I know the person who did. He was a neighbor up the street a little way, because he put out some big plate glass window in another house when he was shooting around. And I went over at Christmas time. He was shooting the ornaments off the Christmas tree, him and his brothers, because they all got BB guns. So anyway, that was a hard thing to go through, because I got in trouble, from my dad for something I didn't do. So I really relate to that part,
So what do you think actually was going through Joseph's mind? He didn't stay there. He escaped away from it because he didn't want to be in the position of even being, where the appearance of evil. He didn't even want that. He just escaped from there. And he didn't care if he lost his position. This was more important to him because it was honoring God. So did you have a comment? No? Okay. So that then leads him to prison. And in prison, what happens to him? He has a couple of people that want him to tell what their dreams mean. And let's read Genesis 40, 1 through 41. Sure, if you want. Genesis 40, 1 through 41. And this is the dreams of Pharaoh, this part of it. But before that happened, he had dreams of two officers that were in the prison while he was in the prison. And one of them was a baker and the other one was a butler. And he interpreted their dreams. And I don't think it happened right away to them what their dreams were, but it did happen to them, the interpretation. So go ahead.
Sometime later, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their royal master. Pharaoh became angry with the two officials, and he put them in the prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. They remained in prison for quite some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, who looked after them. While they were in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker each had a dream one night, and each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed they both looked upset. "Why do you look so worried today?" he asked them, and they replied, "We both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean." "Interpreting dreams is God's business," Joseph replied. "Go ahead and tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream first. "In my dream," he said, "I saw a grapevine in front of me. The vine had 3 branches that began to bud and blossom, and soon it produced clusters of ripe grapes. I was holding Pharaoh's wine cup in my hand, so I took a cluster of grapes and squeezed the juice into the cup, Then I placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. This is what the dream means, Joseph said. The 3 branches represent 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position as his chief cupbearer. And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh, so he might let me out of this place, for I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it. Then the chief baker saw that Joseph had given the first dream such a positive interpretation. He said to Joseph, I had a dream too. In my dream, there were 3 baskets of white pastries stacked on my head. The top basket contained all kinds of pastries for Pharaoh, but the birds came and ate them from the basket on my head. This is what the dream means, Joseph told him. The 3 baskets also represent 3 days. 3 days from now, Pharaoh will lift you up and impale your body on a pole. Then birds will come and peck away at your flesh. Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later, and he prepared a banquet for all his officials and staff. He summoned his chief cupbearer and chief baker to join the other officials. Then he restored the chief cupbearer to his former position, so he could again hand Pharaoh his cup. But the Pharaoh impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had predicted, when he interpreted his dream. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought.
It's amazing that people that were actually had these positions at one time had these dreams, and it seemed like everybody knew that Joseph could interpret the dreams, and so he did. So the next one is the butler basically forgot about Joseph, and then later Pharaoh has dreams, and those dreams are then interpreted by Joseph. So do you want to read Genesis 41?
Now it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine-looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke. He slept and dreamed a second time, and suddenly 7 heads of grain came up out of one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them, and the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. We each had a dream in one night. He and I, each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved and changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one here who can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream and interpret it. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream I stood on the bank of the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine-looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such ugliness as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first 7, the fat cows. Then when they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly as at the beginning. So I awoke. Also I saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up on one stalk, full and good. Then behold, 7 heads withered, thin and blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, and there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty heads, blighted by the east wind, are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of the good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh. And let them be kept food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in a second chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, Bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him a wife, Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout the land of Egypt. Now in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain, as the sand of the sea, until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of the famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph had said, the famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do." The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all the countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all the lands.
Have there been times in your life where you felt like God wasn't with you, and yet later you saw that God had been with you all the time, and he was actually answering prayers when you didn't even know that God was close to you? I think that's what this whole story is telling us, is that here Joseph was in prison. He told interpretations of dreams to those that were in prison. Later, then he got out of prison, and he not only got out of prison, but he became one of the greatest in the whole land. And so I think we need to stop and think about, is God working in our life even when we don't think he is?
Just a thought, I remember someone sharing one time to always be faithful. We need to always remember to be faithful in the little things. Joseph was faithful in all that he did for Potiphar, and God was able to train him through that experience. He didn't like to see him suffer and go through that, but he used those bad experiences to train him for the great experience he was going to have one day, and being second in command over all the land of Egypt. So I think that's a lesson we need to remember, that, to be faithful wherever we are at. Paul says, wherever God found you, be faithful and do it with all your might until God calls you to do something else.
That's right. So I found something in a book. This is in the beginning, and it's actually Patriarchs and Prophets. So I wanted to read this. The sin of Jacob and the train of events to which it led had not failed to exert an influence for evil, an influence that revealed its bitter fruit in the character and life of his sons. As these sons arrived at manhood, they developed serious faults. The results of polygamy were manifest in the household. This terrible evil tends to dry up the very springs of love, and its influence weakens the most sacred ties. The jealousy of the several mothers had embittered the family relation. The children had grown up contentious and impatient of control. And the father's life was darkened with anxiety and grief. There was one, however, of a widely different character, the elder son of Rachel, Joseph, whose rare personal beauty seemed to but reflect the inward beauty of mind and heart, pure, active, and joyous. The lad gave evidence also of moral earnest and firmness. He listened to his father's instructions, and he loved to obey God. The qualities that afterward distinguished him in Egypt, gentleness, fidelity, truthfulness, were already manifest in his daily life long before he ever went to Egypt. His mother being dead, his affections clung the more closely to his father, and Jacob's heart was bound up in this child of his old age. He loved Joseph more than all his other children. So sometimes when all of this happens, we don't understand what God's plan is. And I think God takes things like this and he takes the things that are evil and he works through people who are genuinely in love with God, and he turns it into good. And when he did this with Joseph, he saved not only Egypt, but he saved his family, because when his family comes, because they're starving, he's able to save them too. So this week I want to think about the prayers that we have, the dreams that we have, the things that we worry about. And this is for me, that I need to give it to God, that I need to let him have it all. I don't need to worry about it for me. God needs to have it because he can handle it. I can't, but he can. And when we have things that are going on in our lives that sometimes feel like God isn't there, we have to trust and know that God is there and that he loves us. So, does anybody have any other thoughts that they want to share about how maybe they relate to these stories?
Well, when I was...
go ahead.
Did you want to say something?
In researching Joseph in history, it's fascinating how everything you're saying has been documented and proven historically about Joseph too. About, some people don't believe these stories, but when you look into history, they always are shocked when they find that they're, the factual evidence that this really happened. It's just the timeline is a little confusing, perhaps, when it took place. But I find that's also really interesting to me. Thank you.
So when I was very young, my mother had 2 boys after me, my brothers Mario and Luigi. And it was up to me. She always told me, you take care of them. You watch over them. And clean up after them. And by the time I was 6 years old, I had 2 little boys. And she had me doing things like a servant, but I didn't know that. I just knew I was obeying my mom. And one day there was a gentleman. My mom was looking out the window, and I said, "What are you looking at?" And she said, "There's a man out there sitting on the porch." And I said, "What does he want?" And she said, "Well, he's probably hungry." And I said, "Well, can we feed him?" It was just natural for me to think of doing something for him. And long story short, I see now that all those years that was being gently and slowly embedded in my makeup. And it has left me with this desire to help people and be a servant, and it doesn't feel bad, it feels good. And it's all the Lord. It's not me. He did it. And I'm like, you are so good. He gave me something that I could never have gotten on my own.
That's right. Well, I think our Sabbath school time is over, so let's close in prayer, okay? Our Heavenly Father, I want to thank you so much for allowing us to have these stories, the stories that give us hope, that know that you love us even when sometimes we feel like you're not there. We know you are. I want to ask you again to be with Dean and with Mona and keep his household safe. Help Dean get well really quick and bring him back. We want to thank you, Lord, for this wonderful Sabbath day. We ask this in your name. Amen.